Welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Anslone Show, and I have a little bit of mixing it up today. I have a guest on. The guest I have lined up is really impressive. I am very happy to have him on. I often tell people he is the most impressive and important libertarian that you haven't heard about. So Joe Terwilliger so I'm just going to read off his bio here because it's quite long, but I want to get it right. Is a professor of neurobiology at Columbia University. You're a member of the board of directors of the Association of Libertarian Educators and the campus co-chair of Columbia's Heterodox Academy and a member of Columbia's Academic Freedom Council. Additionally, and this is kind of how we ended up meeting, and the first story that we exchanged is you actually served as an intermediary and helped to get Dennis Rodman to North Korea, and you were with him as he met with and taught to Kim Jong-un several times and actually taught at a North Korean college. And so, Joe, welcome to my show. I'm very happy to have you here today. And did I get everything in your bio right?
Sounds good to me. I'm easy. You got my name right. That's the important part.
All right. So, of course, being a Columbia University professor, your school is probably in the news now more than ever before. And you actually wrote an article on this that I'm really looking forward to talking to you about. But first, I want to ask you about North Korea because I think this is so important. And since I have you, I want to ask you because I think in the coming months, as we move forward here, this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. Right now on the foreign policy stage, the issue is being dominated by the wars in Ukraine and Israel. But eventually, I do believe Kim Jong-un is going to get Donald Trump's attention. And of course, it could go one of two ways, either the fire and fury or exchanging letters and getting along as friends. And so in November, after Trump was elected, I wrote this article for antiwar.com, the man who could help bring peace to Korea. And it was actually about you. I interviewed you, Joe, and I mentioned in the article that you believe there is an opportunity for diplomacy and you could be just the man to get the job done. You are one of very few people in the West who know him personally, and you have a positive relationship with him. And at the time, you told me, I think they mistrust us, but trust building is needed. And there is a personal relationship that Trump and I have with North Koreans that could be used for good. The objectives should be exchange of ambassadors, end of war treaty, and an agreement about peaceful coexistence of North and South Korea without the baggage of unification issues or denuclearization. And so, Joe, unfortunately, you're not in the Trump administration to help broker this deal. But right now, I guess, do you think that outcome is still possible?
Sure. Right now, Trump has done one of the things that we brought up when we talked the last time, which is he has openly called North Korea a nuclear power. And so did Pete Hegseth the other day. And all these things are important to them because it's how they see themselves and it's part of, their national psyche. And saying that, I'm sure, is a positive first step. It was one of the few things that I mentioned that would help, get things started. I also believe that Trump wants to do this. He sees it as kind of unfinished business from his first term. And I think there's a genuine opportunity, although it's going to have to wait until the Ukraine war is solved because there are issues of the sort of marriage of convenience that North Korea and Russia have engaged in over the last year, where Russia, vetoed the sort of sanctions enforcement group at the UN and are providing North Korea with some technical assistance and other things in exchange for, ammunition, maybe some weaponry, and possibly human forces on the line. Although who knows? The fog of war makes it hard to know what's actually happening there. But I think
two questions just to kind of follow up on a couple of things you said there. One, and just maybe explain to the audience, what is the agreement that North Korea now has with Russia? And how do you think this impacts the potential for a deal to get done between the US and North Korea?
Mm-hmm. Well, the North Koreans and the Russians signed this wide-ranging partnership agreement where they agreed to exchange. They've exchanged lots of delegations in different fields, everything from sports to science to technology to military. And The thing is that I think that North Korea kind of got tired of waiting for the US to agree to anything. They got frustrated after the Hanoi summit with Trump, and it never got a chance to pick up after that because of COVID and all the things associated with that. So I think that there's an opportunity to do something. The problem is that in the past, whenever there were negotiations between the U.S. and the North Koreans, the Russians tried to help. They wanted the U.S. and North Korea to get together, and they wanted them to solve this problem because everything that's going on with the tensions in the Korean Peninsula is directly on Russia's border, just as is on China's border. So they really want that problem to become less dangerous because of their own selfish reasons. But at the moment, Russia and North Korea have this wide-ranging partnership. They also recently signed something similar with Iran. The idea being that, we've put so much sanctions against North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, that they have to deal with each other. And we're pushing them into this sort of an alliance of convenience when none of those countries actually liked each other. But now they have almost sustainable relationships because they're building so much and they're trying to make it so multifaceted to replace the relationships that all of them lost with the West after these sanctions started being enforced in general. So the problem is that Russia is going to try to stop, I would assume would try to stop us from making any real progress in détente with North Korea, because we would, of course, push North Korea to break up with Russia, right? And Russia really doesn't want that because right now it's one of the few reliable allies they have. Now, of course, the North Koreans have plenty of reasons not to trust the Russians or the Chinese. They really don't like the Chinese, but the Russians they see as less dangerous because they don't have so much historical animosity and they're not Asian like them. They're not really treated like little brothers. So they're dealing with them because it's easier, But I just think that they don't necessarily trust them because they lost all their support from them at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's been wishy-washy ever since. Russia supported the sanctions, the UN sanctions against North Korea after their nuclear test and all this, because again, they don't want instability on their border and they don't want danger. So it's always a difficult situation dealing with there. But just the way that the US has bolstered all these alliances with Taiwan and Japan and Korea, South Korea, which are countries that never were that close before, and Philippines, we're trying to put this sort of strangling noose around those four countries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, to the point where it's getting closer and closer. And you're getting all these flashpoints that are right on the border, and North Korea and South Korea border is one of those. So that's why this is really important to the Russians and the Chinese and everything, because we're increasing the pressure throughout the Biden administration. Now, Trump has a different view of this. He's less focused on alliance building and all that and more on dealing one-on-one. And I think we've seen that in his conversations with Putin this week and in recent months. And I expect more to happen in that direction because I'm pretty sure Trump wants to stabilize relationships between the U.S. and Russia. And the U.S., I actually think U.S. and China is also going to improve because they don't really have anywhere else to go. And Trump doesn't dislike other major powers. He dislikes this idea that we're going to get sucked into World War III over minor conflicts in border regions that don't really have vital American interests. That's his big issue with Ukraine. That's his issue with North Korea. That's his issue with all these areas that are in that region where conflict is the most likely to trigger a major international war.
So, the biggest story coming out of the Korean Peninsula over the past few months was the South Korean president Yoon Suk Yeol declaring martial law, that getting, I guess, defeated, slapped down fairly quickly. I think he was under house arrest for some time. And you wrote this article for us at antiwar.com, how Yoon's martial law blunder could help Trump make peace. And at the time you explained, it's an ironic twist of fate that exactly 8 years after Park Geun-hye's impeachment paved the way for the Trump-Kim bromance of 2018 and 2019, there's a possibility for history to repeat itself, just as Trump is preparing to return to office for a second time. And so do you still think that this paves the way for I guess somebody more interested in negotiations with North Korea to come to power in South Korea?
It's highly possible. I mean, because if he does get removed, and he's also being charged with insurrection for which he faces potential prison time and stuff, if he's out, traditionally, that would mean that the opposition party, which is more favor of engagement and sort of things, would be likely to win. Although the head of that party is also a bit out of fashion, and there've actually recently been rallies in support of Yoon that are pretty large. So it's hard to predict in today's divided political environment, which is just as bad, if not worse, in South Korea than it is in America, that people are going to really, necessarily follow the historical pattern. But I certainly hope so, because if like Yoon has been a hardliner, he's the one that really pushed North Korea into the position that it took against South Korea, where they decided they no longer want unification. They no longer want to be the same country, that they're separate nations, and they should pursue peace in the future on that basis. Well, I think that sets up for a long-term benefit for peace, but in the short term, it was very dangerous because, the increase in military exercises and all this sort of stuff that's going on between the two Koreas is getting more and more intense. So now nothing much has happened over the last few months. The government's kind of in a place where it can't really do very much of anything, which is maybe a good thing. We libertarians tend to like it when government can't do anything. That's usually the only time we're safe, right? But I think that for Trump, it would be better to have somebody from the South Korean left in charge, because it opens the possibility for him to engage with North Korea without having to risk alienating the South Koreans. And obviously, it's very hard to do if South Korea is not on board with it. So I would hope, personally, for a change in the administration, the change in party governing in the South, solely so that Trump at least has the chance to do it, because it's going to be very difficult otherwise. I think that's part of the reason he hasn't really talked much about it, hasn't done much about it, because as long as South Korea is controlled by, these sort of extreme conservative side, there's nothing he can easily do without alienating South Korea. And these days, South Koreans are all talking about how they want to get nuclear weapons because they're afraid that Trump might not cover them with America's nuclear umbrella anymore. And that, to me, seems like the most stupid thing of all, because who is South Korea actually going to use nuclear weapons against? I mean, they're not going to use them at North Korea, because then they get contaminated by the fallout. I mean, Pyongyang's only, like 100 miles from Seoul. So, I mean, it's absurd that they're going to want nuclear weapons to target North Korea. North Korea doesn't want them either to target South Korea. They're thinking Japan and the United States, Guam, things like that are, away, the wind blows away from those places away from North Korea, because they certainly don't want to contaminate themselves. But it's getting dangerous now, because the South Korean right is actually very eagerly pushing for their own nuclear arsenal, which would really be a blow to non-proliferation efforts around the world, which is the only reason the U.S. takes such a hardline policy on North Korea. They don't really worry, I think, about North Korea being a threat. They worry about the threat of letting North Korea get away with being a nuclear power and having all these weapons, because then it would make Iran think they can do it, and other countries think they can do it too. And so that's why they punish North Korea to the insane degree that we do, to make life absolutely miserable there. So other countries are like, shit, I don't want that to happen to me.
Huh. All right, that's it. Because I would have kind of pointed to the Biden administration, and I think when it came to the first island chain,
Yeah.
and East Asia in general, their kind of concept wasn't even about North Korea. I think oftentimes when they were doing things like pushing South Korea and Japan into a trilateral military pact, this is really about Taiwan. This is really about Beijing. However, Pyongyang is the weakest actor, right? You have the two Asian supergiants, Russia and China, right next to each other. And, for them, the US could be far more provocative. But when it comes to North Korea, these war games are a really big deal to the North Koreans. And so I'm just wondering what you think is kind of the status of the US relationship, or the U.S. ties, or the tensions between the U.S., South Korea, and North Korea on the Korean Peninsula at the end of the Biden administration, as compared to maybe when Trump took office the first time.
Yeah, well, when Trump took office the first time, it wasn't that different, actually. I mean, it was Obama administration coming before, and it wasn't that different from what happened with Biden, that you had a very conservative president in South Korea that was very hawkish on the North. And now you have one again, right? Each of them end up getting impeached right before Trump takes office. Each of them will have their trials in the spring after Trump took office. So there's a lot of actual parallels there. I tend to think, I mean, you're obviously right that Beijing is really the target. As I said, we're putting this encircling noose around North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, moving NATO closer and closer to Russia, getting the Emirates and the Saudis and everybody on board with the Abraham Accords, trying to really pressure Iran, and the same thing in East Asia. And of course, North Korea is sitting here and they're in the middle of it. The reason that they want nuclear weapons and stuff is because we have constantly said, no president in my lifetime has ever said that we don't want to get regime change in Pyongyang. We say it all the time. We're open about it. There's nothing hidden. Trump was less so than the others, which is why they were willing to talk, I think. But we constantly make it clear we don't want the regime to stay in power. Our government makes it clear. At the same time, we also say we refuse to take first use of nuclear weapons in a war with North Korea off the table. And in that environment, if I'm Kim Jong-un, I'm going to want nuclear weapons too, because it's the only meaningful deterrent that they can possibly have against the world's largest superpower. I mean, as he told me, he said, Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction and you guys killed Gaddafi. He's like, Saddam Hussein let weapons inspectors look all over his country for weapons of mass destruction. They didn't find any. You lied to the UN and bombed them anyway. Pakistan, they had nuclear weapons and you didn't try to overthrow the regime to get Osama bin Laden when they held him, even though he was your number one enemy. So there's all these reasons that they're going to want to have nuclear weapons. And that really should not be the focus of our discussions at this point, because it's kind of a foregone conclusion. You have a country there that's got existential threat through essentially living under martial law because they're scared to death that the United States and the other world powers are going to try to remove the regime and change the government, and no one in this country seems to be denying it. The sanctions and everything else seem to be aimed at pressuring them to change the leadership and to destabilize the regime. And of course, it's not working. But I have to question the very concept that this is a good thing, because destabilizing that regime and risking regime change is the one situation where nuclear weapons actually get used by them. Because, in Iraq after the war, the first thing we did was take everybody in the Ba'ath Party and remove them from power. We said, you can't be in the new government. You guys are no good. And so anybody that has access to the nuclear weapons is certainly in the party in North Korea. And they realize that if there's an end to the regime, they're done, right? They have no future. So, of course, they're going to do anything they can not to face that reality. And if they're pushed to a point of no return, why not launch a strike? Why not just go out in a blaze of glory and prove to the world that you actually had this power and could stand up to the world's number one superpower? So it all makes sense. There's nothing irrational about what they're doing. And there is something irrational about what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I guess one thing that I wanted to ask you about is, now that we're in the Trump era again, it does seem like there's this real opportunity for things to go in the right direction. And I'm just wondering if, Kim Jong-un called you tomorrow and said, how should I handle the situation? Because, I think you actually have pretty good insights into Trump's personality. I know you've read his books and you're kind of familiar with the man, and you also know Kim. And if, I guess, from my perspective, what I would tell Kim is to be on the back burner until the situation in Ukraine is resolved. And then Trump could dedicate more time to the situation, more attention to it. It's not going to feel like, oh, I just have to deal with the North Korean problem through overwhelming force and then be done with it. And so that would be one. And then the other point would be, but what do you do about the American and South Korean war games? Because at the end of the Trump administration, North Korea was in a self-imposed missile. They weren't test firing missiles, and the U.S. and South Korea weren't conducting live fire war games. But now, not only are the live firing war games happening, we actually just had South Korea bomb a South Korean town, but also a U.S. aircraft carrier showed up on the Korean Peninsula. This is a major provocation to the North Koreans. And so how would you advise Kim to handle the American and South Korean provocations while also trying to stay off of Trump's radar?
Yeah, I mean, it's just wait, and test all the things you want to test. You got no reason not to, because they're not going to do anything about it now. The thing that I think really you have to remember is that Trump is the one who canceled all these military exercises. And why did he do that? Because they cost a lot of money. And he likes to save money. And I guess Elon Musk is the one who's going to have to tell him, why don't you cut out these war games? Because it's a waste of money. It's not going to lead anywhere. And you don't really, there's not a whole lot of point to it, because I don't think anybody expects that if there's a war with North Korea, it's going to be a conventional invasion of the type that the war games are usually dealing with. It's going to be, pretty awful. So I really don't see the benefit of doing these continued war games. And I don't think Trump does either. It's in his interests and in his personality and his style to stop doing that sort of thing. So I expect that to happen.
So one last question on the Korea subject. One of your new colleagues at Columbia University, Mike Pompeo, has done some monstrous things in his career, but one of the only, and maybe the only positive thing that he did was, as CIA director, he handed Trump an assessment that said Kim Jong-un is a sane individual. And, that would, first of all, probably make you not want regime change in Pyongyang, since there are nuclear weapons there, and having a sane finger on the button is probably better to deal with. But I just want to know if you still think that Kim is somebody who can be dealt with from the West, that, he hasn't maybe gotten a little crazy or a little too bold. Maybe his relationship with Putin has made him feel like he doesn't need to make a deal with the Americans. Just curious on your thoughts there.
Yeah, I don't think that anything about the situation between North Korea and Russia is going to change their desire in the long term for a relationship with America. I think that Kim also and Trump, they have a good personal relationship and they understand this. But like they always say, the problem in America is not the current president. It's not Trump. He's not worried, I think, about Trump, and he would like to deal with him. What he worries about is what comes next, because our entire history is about making deals with regimes that don't like us, and then the next president breaks them. I mean, you go back to Clinton. He made a deal with the North Koreans to give them light water nuclear reactors in exchange for them shutting down the one where they were getting all the material to make bombs with. And Bush slow walked it when he got into power and never provided them with all the oil that we promised to fuel the country in the meantime. Then, of course, Bush made the deal with Gaddafi. Like, you're with us or against us. He was with us. We gave him security guarantees. And then during Obama's administration, Hillary Clinton, we came, we saw, he died. And we got rid of Gaddafi. Right? Then you got, we had, what was it? The Obama administration did the JCPOA with Iran. And then Trump killed that one because, it's a bad deal. I'll make a better deal. And then Trump started the deals with North Korea. And then Biden went back to shutting the door and not wanting to work with them. So we have this constant history where we don't keep our word to them. And I think that's the incredibly important thing, that we have to do things that are, we ask them for complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. But we don't give them anything that's irreversible, because we reverse everything when the next president comes. So there's things we can do that are irreversible, but they're small. But I think that those are the real things that Trump absolutely needs to focus on if he wants to make a deal with them, because they're things that would be mutually beneficial that I think you can do that are very hard for the next president to make go away. Things like you said, like open a liaison office in each other's capitals. Yes, the North Koreans already have representatives here in New York, but they can only travel 25 miles from Columbus Circle without special permission. It'd be better to have some in DC where they can talk to the guys that are actually in power. And it would be good for America to have a voice in Pyongyang where you can reach the government, directly. Again, the end of war thing that we talked about, it's a meaningless gesture almost to sign a paper saying the war is over. And they really want that. And I think it's good for everybody to have that. And it doesn't really cost you very much, but there's all this opposition to it on purely psychological, emotional, and political grounds. The other things that, I mentioned is things like, for example, at the United Nations, the sanctions on North Korea because of the nuclear test are in place in perpetuity until the UN votes to remove them. Now, we can veto such a vote any year. What I would suggest, a simple and easy thing that we could do is say, we're going to make it so that the UN sanctions are up for review every year. So yes, either Russia or China could veto them at the UN if they wanted to, and that would be the end of the sanctions. But we can still keep ours in place on them if we wanted to. And we could remove them if we wanted to as well. So there's all these kind of things that we can give them that are much more difficult for the next president, AOC, God forbid, someone like that takes over and wants to undo these. They can't.
Right.
So we
Yeah.
got to really be thinking on what we can give them that they'll actually trust, that we'll keep our word about. Use that as
Right.
a way to make them feel less threatened, because as long as you feel like your existence is threatened, you're going to want nuclear weapons, and you're going to want an unstoppable power to oppose us with, right? You got to make
Right.
them feel comfortable first. They have to feel secure. And I think the fact that North Korea has said we no longer want unification helps us get there a little bit, even though South Koreans are going batshit crazy over this statement, because to South Korea, unification means absorption of North Korea into South Korea. For North Korea, it meant, okay, one nation, two systems. We don't want to live under your system, but we don't want the threats anymore. But North Korea really has no desire to take over South Korea, because that would be like self-defeating, because North Korea doesn't even want their people listening to South Korean music or watching South Korean TV. The last thing they want is to have them in the same country where they can actually talk to each other and get ideas from these worldly South Koreans. It would spoil their puritanical communist paradise, right? So they're not a threat. And so we have to get out of this idea of thinking that North Korea is an imperialistic threat, because they never attacked anybody in life other than the civil war between North and South Korea, we and China and everybody got involved in. But other than that, there's no real evidence that there's a risk. And right now they have nothing to gain by attacking South Korea. So there's no reason to think they're going to. In fact, they're blowing up all the connections and things in the DMZ and stuff between the two Koreas to make it harder for South Koreans to attack them. Because there was a real risk that Yoon Suk-yeol was going to initiate an attack as part of this martial law declaration to increase his grasp on power. And there's a real danger of that. I think it's far more risky that South Korea starts a war with North Korea than the other way around, because they at least have something to gain. They got North Korea has 2/3 of the world's rare earths, right? I mean, everybody wants those. Trump certainly wants those. And that's why he wants to get along with them. So we get a way to get some of those and help get some of that material out of there.
Well, Joe, as always, I could spend all day talking to you about North Korea, but you do
Okay.
have a brand new article out here at the Mises Institute. Oops, Trump just bankrolled the protesters he intended to silence. And, I'll just kind of let you lay out your argument in the article, which I think is a really interesting take on it. And that is, you think this is actually going to kind of increase the power or the influence that the protesters have.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, why do people protest? They want to
get attention.
Yeah, to get attention and to influence decision makers, right? They want publicity, attention, and power, right? That's the only reason you do it. Maybe you also want to convince some of your fellow students that they should take on your position, but for the most part, it's to try to make your group, which usually the people protesting aren't the majority, they're a relatively small group. And it's to make it seem bigger than it is, because if it seems bigger than it is, more people think you have a valid point and want to join on, and you get more attention drawn to your cause. Doesn't matter what the cause is, right? And so everybody's thinking about this in terms of this Israel-Palestine issue. But I always say, for free speech issues, the problem on campus isn't that anybody felt, I think, actually physically scared because of the protests. It's that the words make them uncomfortable, and words do make people uncomfortable. And everybody supports free speech for ideas they agree with. So I like a simple example that I can give you, which is if you say puppies are cute, nobody wants to ban that speech, right? Everyone agrees with that. Mm-hmm. But what if I tell you something I believe that 100 million people around the world agree with me about that's less popular? Puppies are delicious. Right, exactly. You're uncomfortable now, right?
Right.
I just made you uncomfortable with my speech, but that doesn't mean my speech should be banned. If I want to have a rally at Columbia in favor of dog meat rights and even give you hot dogs, literally, to try it, you can engage with that. And that could be something that I guarantee you 95% of your audience is now saying, okay, this guy's nuts and he's an extremist and he's crazy. And I do not like that opinion. But that's the kind of thing that's going on campus in a way. So if you're Jewish or Israeli and someone says from the river to the sea, that's threatening because they're saying you shouldn't exist, and they get nervous and it makes them really uncomfortable. Like if I tell a dog lover that dogs are delicious, they get uncomfortable. And it's the same in the other direction. Like I know a lot of libertarians were upset because I said, well, these protesters are being rewarded by Trump, and this giving them $400 million actually, I believe, helps them because it gives them actual power to shut down a lot of the activities of the university, and it makes everybody afraid of them. Where they weren't afraid of them before, they were a small group of people with an opinion that wanted attention. Fox News gave it to them. They used camera angles to make it look like our entire campus was covered with protests everywhere, when it was really just one small corner of one quad on the campus. And most days they weren't even there. The days they were there, they were in a very small region. And so the news media amplified it. The right amplified it to say, look at these horrible people. They're a threat to mankind, and there is a war zone. And the left took the same pictures and said, oh, look at all these people. They're starting the revolution. They're going to change the world. And both sides were exaggerating what was going on, because it benefited them and it also benefited the protesters, right? So Fox gave them what they wanted. MSNBC gave them what they wanted. And somehow Trump thought, okay, well, we'll shut it down by giving them $400 million, by taking $400 million away from Columbia. But that's more power than they ever could have dreamed of. So it's like a protester's dream in a way, right? And even this poor guy who's being deported, and of course, I don't think anyone should be ever deported for their speech, even if it is dogs taste great, we want dog meat on every corner. That you shouldn't be deported for that and lose your green card, right? That should be covered by free speech. But this kid, he just made $1 million. He's got a book deal coming. He's internationally famous. And instead of being demonized, more people around the world are thinking, yeah, this poor guy, and people are coming to his defense who never would have heard of him before. So he may not be able to live out his life in America, depending on what happens, but he can go to Britain and be a celebrity. And I'm like, Trump didn't intend that to happen, but this is the law of unintended consequences. When you start get the government interfering with the actions of private individuals and their speech, they almost always end up making things worse and almost always undermine their own ideas. That's why we don't want the government having that power. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I want to ask you about one of the things you mentioned in your article is that, as small as you're saying the protests were that pretty small, they weren't very disruptive to campus activities, but you do mention that Columbia's reaction to the protest, asking for IDs, has made campus life feel somewhat oppressive. And so
Well,
I was just wondering if you'd talk about that.
I mean, I would just say that, we have a lot of these events like Heterodox Academy and other groups on campus where they have listening tables where students come just to encourage free speech. So, our goal with like the Heterodox Academy thing is to let people talk to each other, right? Their slogan is like, great minds don't always think alike. And the idea is that instead of yelling at each other and demonizing each other and making each other afraid of each other, why don't you just get together at a table and talk? So they started all these things, assuming people were all going to come and talk about the protests. And most people that came just came and complained about the lockdown, because they're like, yeah, it's not a normal campus life. The reason you go to college is networking, to meet people and to exchange ideas with people. And then, only people with ideas can get on campus. So it's much less. Now, there was nothing else Columbia could do. Columbia did the right thing in doing this because it did put an end to all the real problems. The big problems we had in 2024 were a small group of protesters on campus suddenly were on the TV all the time with drone footage, making it look like there's thousands of them everywhere and, creating chaos. And then this came to the attention of all these outside agitators who came in, joined the problem, and fueled them to some of these actions that were just crazy, like taking over a building and locking themselves in and doing some real damage to stuff. And all those people, they were all punished and everything. But the thing is that wasn't what was happening originally. So it metastasized because of the attention, as it always does, right? You give a small group of protesters the attention that they're craving, and it's nothing about the issue. I've said nothing about my opinions at all about the issue in the article or in general, because it's not what the topic should be about. And yet when you amplify the message to the point where it looks like a majority opinion, and like everybody at Columbia agrees with this, it creates an environment where more people come in, they take advantage of it, the power grows, the size grows, and it just amplifies the voice that, at least in this case, Trump and Fox were trying to silence. They actually amplified it. And that was what I was trying to point out with the article. Not a criticism necessarily of anyone involved, just saying that when you do things, they have responses. It's not like your actions are in a vacuum. And in a way, it created the situation. So this week, there's bigger protests than ever before, not on campus, because we are ID controlled. And I think that's a good thing, because it is preventing things from getting too out of control to disrupt the students' activities and research that's going on. But throughout the city, there's protests this week that are much bigger than they were before in response to the actions that Trump took and the amplification of the voice of these people by the media.
Right. Now, you did mention there are some First Amendment issues with all of this.
Sure.
It seems like there is one particular issue where the Trump administration is interested in cracking down on free speech. We played the clip on this show in the past a couple of times of Trump at his address to Congress announcing that free speech was back in America. And certainly this was one of the things I was really hoping for, was that Trump really was going to usher in this, more free speech centric. We have been through all the hysteria around Russiagate and all the narrative control around the war in Ukraine was unprovoked. Putin's aggression was unprovoked. You can't mention NATO expansion or any of that. And I was really hoping it would feel like the boot was coming off of all of our nets just a little bit, but it doesn't seem like that's happening. And one of your colleagues at Columbia University, Professor Jeffrey Satz, gave his take on the reason for this week on Judging Freedom with Judge Napolitano. Chris, can we play that clip? And then Joe, I'll get your reaction after.
The issue here is that the U.S. government feels that it has to respond to the Israel lobby. That's what's happening. This isn't even coming from Trump or coming from the administration itself. It's like you say, they're taking orders. It's shocking. And it's worse. And by the way, it's even deeper than the free speech crisis, because to carry out this destruction of American institutions at the behest of the Israel lobby and this extreme nationalist Zionism, to carry this out, the administration is ignoring judicial decisions, judicial orders. This is even more than repressing the free speech. Judges are saying, don't deport these people. The government's saying, who the heck are you to tell us what to do? So we are actually in a kind of crisis that even the kings of England didn't carry out. We've lost habeas corpus. We've lost a judicial decision having the rule of law in this country in recent days. And this is coming from groups like the Israeli American Council. This is coming from the Israel lobby. There's no doubt about it.
So I guess my first question is, Joe, in all of your years at Columbia, have you ever encountered an administration getting so involved on a level and, taking away funding and what seems to us to be these First Amendment violations for another issue?
I've never experienced that before. And now, as libertarians, we're all believe maybe there's too much government funding of private institutions and education, but shutting it down on the basis of the content of speech seems like, how can that not be in some way a First Amendment violation? That's just, it seems like common sense. And the problem of letting it happen, let's forget about like who is pushing for it now or who's pushing for it other times, is that Trump is basically creating safe spaces that the conservatives have opposed for the last 10 years, because they were concerned it was all safe spaces for people who felt offended by anti-woke comments, right? Or when Trump got elected, they had, emotional support animals in safe spaces where no one who supported Trump could go so that they could feel comfortable. And we ridiculed them, as libertarians or conservatives did. And now they're doing the same thing. They're saying, oh, we need safe spaces. My argument was maybe instead of emotional support animals for the Jewish students, if they're actually afraid, get them an emotional support pit bull, and then they don't have to worry at all, if they're at all nervous. But I just think it's ironic because everybody in America, as I said, is happy when you say puppies are cute. But when you say puppies are delicious, unless you happen to be Korean or Chinese, and the places where I've actually eaten dog, and they are delicious, unless you're in that group, you're going to feel like they shouldn't be allowed to say it.
Right. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining me here today. I will definitely have you back on the show, especially as I do think we're going to, in the coming months, and hopefully as the war in Ukraine winds down, I think tensions are first going to escalate on the Korean Peninsula, and then maybe we will have some talks between Trump and Kim, and could see a possible real de-escalation. And I'll certainly want your take on all of that. So I really appreciate you joining me today. Stay safe on the hotbed of the campus protests again in America, Columbia University.
Well,
We'll talk to you again
just to
soon.
be fair, like I'm at the medical school. There were no protests at the medical school. Yeah, we're the only ones getting grants cut, which is even funnier.
Interesting. Well, thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the show today. I really am enjoying doing these interviews. Hopefully I'm going to get just a little bit neater with them as we move forward. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the program and you're listening to it. And we'll be back with another episode soon.